gonna throw. One-on-one, Davis has it. Touchdown! Carolina wins! Carolina is the Coastal Division champion! Javonte Williams to the left of Howell. He'll send him out into the flat right side. Howell looking, standing tall, lets it go, man there! Touchdown! Touchdown, Carolina! The pistol, Jackson behind him. Hands off to Jackson, he tried a jump pass, and it's intercepted! Zack intercepts it! Holy cow, Carolina's gonna win! And off to Javonte Williams again, pops it to the left. Javonte leaps over a man, crosses the 50, trucks over a defender, spins by another. Goodness gracious, he's down to about the 15, and he did absolutely everything in one carry.
Here's the shotgun snap to Aguilar. Drops back, pressure coming, Aguilar floats it up, incomplete! No flags! Head on back up the mountain! Carolina wins it in double overtime! Loftus, out of the shotgun, throws to the end zone, incomplete! Incomplete! The bell belongs to us! Carolina wins it 47-45 in double overtime!
Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, here with you guys, as always. Zack Hubbard alongside of us, and that means it is time for another Tar Heel recruiting edition of the podcast here. Once again, the Tar Heels go on to the 2026 recruiting trail and pick up a huge commitment in the class. And so Carolina, we're going to be breaking that down today. What does it mean for Carolina? Because now they have two wide receivers that are committed in the class that are four-star prospects. So we'll break all that down, and then we have to update you on where Carolina stands with some of the other guys that are still remaining on the board. Who is still out there that Carolina is pursuing? Because we've had some guys that have come off the board, a good amount of them, actually, and now we enter a stretch where there are going to be some key recruitments that will be coming to an end here soon. So we'll tell you all about that here on this edition of the show. But as I mentioned, Carolina with their second four-star wide receiver commitment in the last week. That happened on Wednesday, yesterday afternoon, when Carnell Warren, the four-star wide receiver out of Bluffton High School in Bluffton, South Carolina, announced his commitment to the Tar Heels, completing a flip from ACC rival Virginia Tech. His commitment came after he took an official visit to Carolina back on the weekend of June 20th, which was the final weekend of official visits before we entered the dead period, and was right after he ended up decommitting from the Hokies. So it was a long play flip for Carolina, but they were able to get it done. Warren, the number 319 overall prospect in the class, the number 50 wide receiver in the 2026 class, according to 24/7 Sports composite player rankings. And this past season as a junior, he led his team in receiving, back-to-back years that he did that. This past year, 59 catches for 846 yards and 14 touchdowns in just 11 games on his way to earning all-region honors, and did make an appearance in the Under Armour Next All-American game, which is actually where he committed to Virginia Tech back in January. Back in 2023, caught 55 passes for 723 yards and 9 touchdowns. So 2 very productive seasons for him. You know, Zack, when I reading off all the stats on him, everything like that, but just your initial thoughts on him committing to Carolina and your initial thoughts on the prospect itself.
Yeah, I think he's a great pickup for sort of that outside receiver spot that we've been looking at. Under this new staff, it does seem like they're sort of honing in on guys that can play one of two roles, sort of a bigger outside receiver and a slot guy. And Warren fills more of that outside role, at least per 24/7 listed at 6'4.5", 195. So pretty big bodied guy. And the first thing that sort of jumps off the page when you look at the film is just his athleticism. He is able to take quick strides, sort of going vertically down the field. He moves pretty well for a guy his size, going either on slant routes or horizontally. Not the best at that as compared to a slot guy, but I would say above average for a guy his size. Really good at the point of attack, really good at getting vertical and catching the football. So he does a lot of these things that you want a guy in sort of his mold to do as an outside receiver. And I'd say he has above average quickness as well. So the number one thing right now is just his natural athleticism that he brings to the position, lets him be pretty well-rounded as a prospect. In terms of his routes, similar to what we see with a lot of high school receivers, it is a lot of just a few types of routes. It's a lot of slants, a lot of curls, and then some vertical go balls, things like that. So that's something that's going to need to continue to develop at the college level. But as of right now, from what you see on film, projecting a few years out, this could be a very, very productive and very, very polished outside receiver, either your number one or number two guy. And it's just continuing to add to this class and to this roster overall. As we've discussed on basically every edition, they're looking to remake this roster, and they will continue to do that with Warren. And then in this class, specifically at the wide receiver spot, now up to 4, I believe, that they have committed.
Yeah, this is their 4th guy that they have committed. Of course, we have to figure out what exactly they're going to do with Jaden Jefferson, if they're going to play him in the slot on the offensive side of the ball or on the defensive side of the ball. But my belief is that they will probably roll with him on the defensive side of the ball, which means, hey, Carolina with 4 guys committed at the wide receiver spot, that's a pretty decent amount, and one that they can certainly do a lot with. When I watched him, I thought the first thing that really jumped off the page to me was his ability to climb the ladder and bring down those jump balls, those 50-50 balls, because Carolina does not really have a guy on the roster that we think that has that skill set, particularly for this year. I don't think there's one guy that really shines in that area, and that's the area that he really shines. I mean, you saw it a little bit his senior year of high school with Jordan Shipp, but I don't think that's necessarily a guy. I mean, he doesn't have the size that Carnell Warren does. At 6'4.5", 195 pounds, I mean, you throw the ball up to this guy and he's able to climb the ladder and go get it. You're talking about a huge, huge range that you can throw into, and he's going to be able to come down with the football. So I really like how he competes in that area. I think just overall, I saw a really complete receiver, a guy that, does a really good job of creating separation at all levels of the field. That's very important. You're just looking for guys that can find a way to get open. And I think he did a really good job of that. Was pretty specific to the routes that he was running. Wasn't a guy that was given a lot of freedom, but when he did, was a guy that just did a good job of finding open space, finding grass, as Phil Longo used to say it. And that was something that, his receivers were able to do a really good job of. And I feel like that's kind of what Carnell Warren is able to do here. Real strong hands catcher of the football. I've talked about how important this is. You want guys that use their hands to haul in the football more often than not, because that shows you how reliable these guys are when they catch it with their hands and don't have to rely on their body. He does a great job of that. I mean, it shows up all over his film, especially, on plays deeper down the field. That was one thing I noticed, was that the deeper the passes down the field, the more he was using his hands to bring in these passes. Seems like he's got pretty reliable hands. So that's something that Carolina will really like about him. And then, I thought there were a couple of different things that really stuck out to me. I thought, even though his route tree wasn't super complex, I really did think that he was a guy that was a strong route runner, runs his routes with full effort, great acceleration on the routes off the line of scrimmage, really does a great job. I mean, it's about running your routes hard to sell these routes to the guys that are on the other side. And we saw that a few times where that's the reason why he's able to get open, is because just of how technical he is running his routes. I also thought that he has, the speed really all over the field. I thought he, it shows up in some of what he does pre-throw, and that's why he's able to get as open as he is. But I also thought it showed up in when he was able to catch the football, tuck it away, and turn upfield. So I really think that he's a guy that just all around, every area of his game is really, really good. And that's something that is going to give him a very high floor at this level. Maybe doesn't give him the best ceiling, probably not as high of a ceiling as a guy like Keon Chapman, but I think is a guy that has a chance to be a very successful receiver at this level for Carolina. And, specifically on the outside, that's where Carolina was looking for some of these guys because, Zamarius Robinson, maybe he can play out there. I think that's certainly an area where you could see him play. But I think, they're looking at him as a guy that has versatility, can play a little bit in the slot for you. Kamori Miles is a guy that's going to play on the outside at 6'2", and then weighing in the 180 range. But he's a guy that's really there to take the top off of the defense, wins with speed. This is a guy that is a little more complete than that. So 2 complete receivers, I think, for Carolina, guys that are going to come in that I could see making immediate impacts for Carolina. This pretty much signifies the end of Carolina at the wide receiver spot, at least from the guys that are listed as wide receivers. They may be looking to add another guy that is incredibly talented in the slot position, an area where Carolina really hasn't addressed that they haven't officially addressed in this class in terms of a wide receiver. Walker Bryson is now off the table, and so that means that Carolina is basically down to C.J. Sadler at the position, Zach. So we've talked about it. There aren't a lot of positions left that Carolina needs to take, but wide receiver is still an area where I feel like there is a need in that slot position. And really it comes down to C.J. Sadler or Deontay Neal, a guy who is still on the table for Carolina as an in-state prospect that could be a take for them, especially if he ends up getting an offer from the basketball program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, looking at sort of the guy that's probably going to come off the board first in CJ Sadler, this has been a guy that's sort of popped up on their radar around mid-June. They brought him in for an official visit out of Detroit, Michigan. So you're always going to be looking at sort of those in-state schools between Michigan and Michigan State. But it certainly feels like North Carolina is in a really, really good spot for him right now. As it currently stands, he is looking to commit within the next week or two. I believe it's still set for July 15th or August 15th, excuse me. So here within the next, 4 to 6 weeks, we'll see this guy come off the board. And really, it looks like it's North Carolina's to lose at the moment. There's still some time left, but I think there's a decent chance that they add him in this class specifically to fill that slot position. And it is a position, like you mentioned, that they still want to add at. Obviously they got some guys in the transfer portal that can play that spot. There's some guys on the roster that could potentially play that spot, but with how important slot receiver has been in past Bill Belichick offenses, we sort of have to assume it's going to be a pretty important spot here as well. So it does seem like a position where they want to make their mark with sort of handpicking their guy. And it feels like Sadler could certainly be that guy. But it's not the only option there, like you mentioned. You have another guy like Deontay Neal that could be an option for the slot position as well. Certainly seems like a guy that maybe they offer or give a committable offer here within the next few weeks. But it seems like right now it may be a guy that goes into the season and, they see what he does from there. Will he get an offer from the basketball team at what is a listed 5'9", 150? I don't know about that necessarily, but it may be one where, it's something that he's looking at and may consider other options down the line. We'll just have to see. But it seems like they have at least some momentum with either option. We'll sort of see what happens with Sadler and, sort of go from there in terms of the wide receiver position or the slot receiver position, I guess, more specifically. But they certainly have some options, and they're going to add some guys here. And as we've said with other positions, the main focus is we want to get guys that we handpick in the program. We're going to put guys out there, and who stays and who leaves. So that's sort of the focus, or that's the mentality that they're taking with this position specifically and with the roster overall. So I say, the more the merrier as it relates to this wide receiver position. It's one of the positions where, you can get guys on the field the earliest. So it would not surprise me, sort of like you mentioned with Keon Chapman and now with Carnell Warren, if we see a number of these guys playing early and not necessarily starting, but in the two deep, when they get on campus in 2026.
Yeah, it really just depends on what the guys that are on this year's roster end up looking like. Wide receiver is probably the position. It's the weirdest position on this year's team, because I think that it's the one that you feel the most confident in terms of the depth that's there. But in terms of the actual talent that's there, I don't really know how to feel. I think this is a team that's going to be really good this year at the wide receiver position, just based off of, guys like Chris Culliver, Jordan Shipp. I'm not going to mention Kobe Paysour because he won't be here next year, but those guys, Alex Taylor, those are guys that you feel pretty good about, and you're feeling confident that they're going to be able to be involved at least in some way. Adrian Wilson, the freshman that transferred from Colorado, also a guy to know and keep an eye on. But the problem is you don't know how many guys are really going to emerge. If these guys end up struggling, a guy like Culliver comes out, doesn't have the type of year that we're expecting. We're basing, his breakout this year off of 7 catches in the first 2 years of his career. So while there is some potential there, and there are some things that I really like about him, this is far from a guarantee that it's going to happen. Jordan Shipp, I think he's the guy that you feel the safest about. But nothing is guaranteed. And so, with some of these guys, if they don't perform up to standard, then there's a good chance that these guys can come in and take over some of those jobs, especially Chapman and Warren, because of just how talented they are. And we've seen freshmen factor in for Carolina at wide receiver before. You go back to when Josh Downs was here, just way too talented. There was no way that you were going to be able to keep him off the field fully, and he eventually gets on the field. I feel like that could be what you're looking at in the 2 receivers that Carolina has in this class, because Warren, I think he's a guy that's a borderline, 4-star according to 24/7 Sports. I think personally he's a guy that should be much higher ranked and should be talked about amongst some of the better receivers in this class because of just how complete his skill set is. So, who knows? You never know the impact that they're going to have. Now, let's move on and let's talk about CJ Sadler's situation. This one is a little bit of a weird one, because I've heard there are a lot of people that are very confident that if he is to commit during the summer, that it is going to be Carolina, that Carolina is the team that's in the best position. But there have been rumors over the last few days that he is going to try to hold out. He's going to wait until the fall and try to take an official visit. And it would probably be, my guess, would be to Michigan. And if he takes an official visit to Michigan, if Michigan is a committable offer for him, which I would believe that it is. This is a guy that's ranked inside of the top 100. So barring something just stunning, I would think that he'll be a take for the Wolverines. Then he will more than likely go there, because that's the team that he has been tied to the most. That's just my feeling personally. That was a guy that, early on in his recruitment took a lot of visits there. That was the place that he frequented the most. A school like Michigan State never really was a threat. I don't even remember, trying to think back to the different websites, I don't remember seeing him even having taken an unofficial visit to Michigan State. So it is definitely all Wolverines for him. But the thing is that, is he willing to wait that long? Is Carolina able to do enough before then to convince him to commit? That's what Carolina ultimately needs to do. I feel confident where Carolina is at right now. If he ends up making that decision here in the near future, then I think it's going to be Carolina. But if he ends up pushing it off to the fall, then I think we're looking at a situation, Zach, where he probably ends up going to Michigan, and then Carolina is, waiting to see whether or not Deontay Neal is willing to commit. Not the worst thing in the world, because if you get Deontay Neal, he was one of the guys that, remember back during the Most Wanted series, I had him on my list. I don't think he was in my top 10 that we did here on the podcast, but he was definitely in the top 25 that I had for the website. So he's a dynamic athlete as well. But CJ Sadler would be a whole nother level, Zach. You're talking about one of the best players in the entire country committing to Carolina if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, whether he sticks with his August commitment date or not, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, Ann Arbor is just a hop, skip, and a jump over from Detroit. So even if he commits then, I mean, he still has the option to take official visits in the fall or close to signing day, and then all bets could be off at that point. So we'll sort of have to keep watching both of these guys. I think regardless of who commits and when they commit throughout the fall, really until signing day, and you get these guys on campus. But it's a position that this is going to keep going for a while. Even with 4 guys committed, they're going to be, they're going to have options moving forward, and it's just something that we're going to continue to have something to talk about at that position probably until these guys are signed.
All right, we move on to Calvin Thomas, and this is the guy that is probably the most interesting to Tar Heel fans right now, because he's a guy that's going to commit over the weekend, the 4-star linebacker out of Cypress Ranch High School in Cypress, Texas. And this is, a guy that Carolina is hoping that they can add to a linebacking core that needs guys there. This would only be their second commitment at the position. Their other commitment, a guy who played 1 year at the linebacker spot in Jaden Griffin-Haynes. So this one's very important. A very talented prospect. There's no doubt about that. Calvin Thomas is a guy that can do just about anything that Carolina is going to need him to do in the middle of this defense. But, when it comes to where his recruitment stands, Carolina goes in feeling pretty confident. Report from Sam Spiegelman of Rivals earlier in the week said that the Tar Heels are the team that has made the late push for him, and they are emerging as the front runner. There was a charge from Nebraska at one point that led to one of the Nebraska beat writers to pick Nebraska in his crystal ball prediction. That has since been flipped in favor of Carolina. So this is one that I think is probably going to end up going Carolina's way when it's all said and done. I think this is certainly what Carolina is hoping ends up happening, but it would be just a massive commitment all the way around. Not only are you getting another headliner to this class, a guy that's ranked inside of the top 300, but also a playmaker at that linebacker spot, a position where Carolina has some talent there this year that they've acquired through the transfer portal, but that talent will be departing after the season is over, and they're going to need some guys to step up there next year. Calvin Thomas might just be that guy if he ends up committing. Oh, Zack dropped off, unfortunately, guys. But he's coming right back up here, so we'll throw him right back in here. Zack, just talking about how important Calvin Thomas was for Carolina. I think this is a really big one for them because of all the guys that they're going to be losing after the season is over. Mekhi Bayor as a depth guy is going to be gone, as well as, of course, starter Andrew Simpson. So with those guys departing after the season, could be a big role for Calvin Thomas if he ends up committing here early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a position where, compared to other ones, they've not had a ton of guys. Like you mentioned, you have at least what you feel is pretty firmly a linebacker commit in Jaden Griffin-Haynes, but only really a year of experience at the position. And then another guy that's sort of been mentioned for that linebacker spot in Lawrence Brown that could be there, could be an edge rusher. So, Calvin Thomas would give you a guy that you feel more strongly about. Hey, this is going to be a guy that is pretty firmly going to be an off-ball linebacker, can come down and blitz, rush the passer if you want him to, but you feel pretty good about him at that spot specifically. out of Cypress, Texas. The Texas schools were initially a little bit more involved, but have taken other guys. So, his recruitment, as you mentioned, moved more so to a Nebraska-North Carolina battle, set to commit on Saturday, and North Carolina looks to be in the pole position. So I think this is another one where they want to really make their mark on the position as a pretty big piece of the defense. And I think this could end up being a very, very good commitment, plays in as sort of a modern linebacker that can do a lot of things for your defense. So it looks really, really good going into Saturday. And I really like what this guy can add as sort of a lean but physical tackler of the football, a guy that can play in space if you want him to, can, drop back in coverage, but can also rush the passer, sort of play any way that you want to play him. And I think that if this commitment does go through, and we still have 2 days to see what that ends up being, but if this goes through, it's really nothing but positives for North Carolina at that linebacker position.
Yeah, if it goes through, then Carolina doesn't have to worry about searching for somebody else a little bit deeper in the class. And I think that's ultimately what they're hoping is going to end up happening, because if you can get him to commit, you're talking about one of the top linebackers in the class, a guy that's going to really be able to do everything that you need him to do as an off-ball linebacker. As you mentioned, that probably allows you to keep Lawrence Brown at the edge rusher spot. It would just be about adding weight to his frame. That would really be the key to keeping him at the defensive end position. There wouldn't be a need for him. And the other thing is, it would probably allow you to keep Julian Burns at the safety position. Now, ultimately, we'll have to wait and see. Julian Burns could be a guy that, because of the way that he plays, Carolina feels like he's much better in that hybrid linebacker safety role. We've seen that a guy like Kamori House, who's going to be starting this year for Carolina at the linebacker spot, he's a guy that, is sort of that hybrid linebacker / safety. That's kind of an element of Steve Belichick's defense. So we'll have to see ultimately how that fares. But this is the guy that could be your typical middle linebacker that can stop the run at a consistent rate, that, has enough ability to drop into coverage to be able to handle himself, but really is there to be your run stopper in the box. If it's not him, then Carolina has one other guy that they could possibly go to that they had on campus for an official visit during the month of June. That would be Japri Wafer. Now, it's going to be interesting. If Carolina lands Thomas, I don't know if Wafer is a take. This is a guy that is literally just waiting with bated breath to find out whether or not Carolina is going to land Calvin Thomas or if they will not. If they do not, I would expect very quickly Wafer to jump on that offer from Carolina. It would be committable at that point, and he would be a guy that would be in Carolina's 2026 recruiting class. If not, I have no idea what ends up happening. If Thomas does end up committing, then I guess his recruitment will probably reopen. This is a guy that, is on 24/7 Sports website as a prospect. He is not on Rivals. He is nowhere to be found. Of course, Rivals and On3 have now combined. Before they combined, he was on neither site. So this is a relative unknown in the class. It seems like he's a guy that's just there in case for Carolina. Very similar to what Deontay Neal is right now for the team at that slot receiver position. And so it's just really a wait and see. Now we get to the defensive tackle spot. And this is the spot where we get into probably the most interesting buzz around prospects, because before, it was really two men that we were talking about, two guys that we were talking about for Carolina. We were talking about three-star defensive lineman T.I. Umokayas from Cherry Creek High School in Inglewood, Colorado. And you were talking about Joseph Pecco from Oaks Christian High School in Westlake Village, California. Now, when it came to Pecco, let's just get this out of the way. There is no way that Carolina's landing him. It's not going to happen. His brother committed there in the offseason. And who did his brother commit to? He committed to the defensive line coach, his father, DeMonte Pecco, who, of course, was a guy that played in the NFL. Many of you will probably remember for the Cincinnati Bengals. this is just not going to go Carolina's way. So now, okay, you're down to Umo Kaius. This is the guy that Carolina has to land. Well, early in the week on Monday, all of a sudden there starts to be a little bit of buzz around a guy that's committed to Oregon. This would be Vila Ame, Mayola. Now he is a guy that I looking at him, definitely borderline 4-star prospect, very talented player, definitely a guy that Carolina should be going after if there is any sort of interest. Very weird scenario that's going on with him right now. He's a guy that, currently plays at Willamette High School out there in Eugene, Oregon, right in Oregon's backyard. It makes sense that the Ducks had him committed, but he ends up decommitting from there. And so what ends up happening is not only is he decommitting from Oregon, he is also transferring high schools. He's going to Thompson High School in Alabaster, Alabama. That's a place that Carolina fans should be familiar with because that's where Connor Harrell went to high school, one of the best schools in the state of Alabama. And so this is a guy now that all of a sudden is in play for Carolina. There has been some gaining buzz around Carolina. Blair Angulo of 24/7 Sports, who covers the West Coast for them, he said that there was that Carolina was the team that was gaining buzz for him recently. It had been a few days before he ended up decommitting, and there is a source that told us here at the Heel Tough blog, and also it was confirmed via his training page, Rising Champions. It's a group that trains out on the West Coast. It trains a lot of those guys out there. Manoa Fapusa was actually a guy that trained with that group. They put out a graphic back in June, in the middle of June, talking about how he was going to take a visit to Carolina. So all of that, it looks like Carolina's down to 2 guys at that position, Zach. But ultimately, I think the guy that's gaining more buzz is the guy that we haven't really talked a whole lot about in Moala. And this is a guy that could end up being the take for Carolina as they look for that second, 2-gap defensive lineman that they can pair with Trayshawn Ruffin in this class.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they've gotten a good number of guys that can play on the outside, either as edge rushers, defensive ends, whatever sort of configuration that you want to put them in. But obviously, not only in this class, but in the previous high school class, in the transfer portal class, they want size on the interior. That's always been important to the Belichick defense, whether it is 4-3 or 3-4, whatever alignment they're in. They want to have someone that can potentially 2-gap if they want to sort of run that. So when you look at a guy that has really put himself in sort of North Carolina crosshairs recently in Moala, this guy fits that mold. I mean, listed at 6'3", 340 pounds. This guy is big. He is physical. He's got a really good motor, I think, from what I can see just from a preliminary glance. So this is one that feels like it's moving pretty fast from, being a guy going to high school in Eugene and committed to the Ducks to now, transferring high schools and reopening his recruitment. This feels like one that North Carolina can sort of swoop in here pretty quickly and get a commitment from a guy that actually was a sort of covert official visitor in June. And it seems like there's some familiarity here regardless, just from that visit moving into July. And I think it could be one where we see this move pretty quickly to North Carolina, potentially finishing out their defensive line class by adding, depending on who you want to consider, where a 5th, 6th, or 7th lineman in this class.
Yeah, it's weird. With him, there was so much buzz around him initially when he ends up decommitting from Oregon. And all of a sudden we're talking about, okay, this is a guy that could be committing. I mean, when Michael Lombardi put out his tweet the other day, we were pretty sure that was who it was. Because it was so recent, we thought to ourselves, okay, this is a guy that now Carolina is, is the favorite for. There are some weird rumors going on that, that Carolina, the reason why he is interested in going to Carolina is that the coaching staff has promised that they can get his dad back into the country. Apparently his dad was, having an immigration issue or some sort of thing. I don't think any of that's true. Based off of what Moala has put on social media, it doesn't seem like any of that's true, that is just another very sad made-up story for someone to start that rumor as the reason why he would want to go to Carolina. But I think, now, today, I've seen some people that are saying they don't feel nearly as confident that he can end up at Carolina, that was really just the initial buzz around it because Carolina was the team that was there, that was talking to him during the time. Once he became decommitted, now there are other teams that are going to get involved. Of course, the fact that he is going to a school like Thompson there in Alabama, all of a sudden now you've got teams in the SEC that are probably starting to contact him, all sorts of stuff. So this is one that if Carolina is going to land him, it feels like they've got to work quickly. You've got to jump on this opportunity because you can get a guy that is a steal, someone you did not think that you were going to be able to get in your class, another guy at 340 pounds that is that space eater in the middle of the defense. You can put him right alongside Trayshawn Ruffin. That's a really good 1-2 tandem right there. I think that's, something that you're hoping Carolina has at the nose tackle position for years moving forward, but you've got to be able to take advantage of that. If it ends up being Umo Kayas, who ends up being the take for Carolina in this class, I'd be perfectly fine with that as well. A little bit of a different tackle, same style of tackle, a guy that is a two-gap type of player, but doesn't have nearly the size that Moala has. I would still see that as a really good consolation prize for Carolina, but I'm not so sure how that recruitment is working out. I think Colorado State, a team that is right down the road from them, is in a really good spot for him. I also think that Washington is a team that could potentially end up landing his commitment. So Carolina's got to be careful here. They don't want to come out in a position where they don't have another defensive line commit, because you may be saying, well, there's a lot of guys that are committed along the defensive line. And look, while that may be true, you got to look at where these guys, are in terms of the size, in terms of what positions they're going to play. I mean, guys that, Carolina has picked up here that I think are probably going to end up playing a little bit of a different position. Jimmy Frisco, Alo Suafau, definitely a guy that I think is going to probably play that edge rusher position, more of that position that Price Yates is going to play this year. So really more of a defensive end position. The other guy that you've got to figure out where exactly you're going to play him is David Jackson, 6'2", 276 pounds, guy that probably could play either one of those spots. It's just about, is he going to thin down a little bit and become more of an edge presence, or is he a guy that they're going to want in the middle of that defense? They've got to make that decision. If they decide that they're going to play him in the middle, all of a sudden this isn't nearly as desperate of a need for Carolina, but I still feel like they want to get at least one more guy with similar size to Ruffin. So it'll be interesting to see how exactly they handle this. Now to the news of two guys that are, not newly on the board for Carolina, but a guy that we haven't talked about in a long time, and one guy that we haven't really talked about at all that Carolina is supposedly targeting in this class. Steve Wiltfong of Rivals, used to be of 24/7 Sports, now of Rivals, was on 3. I mean, it's just, there's so many things that are changing going on with the recruiting community right now. He put out a tweet earlier today that said that the Tar Heels are in position for two other 4-star prospects to go along with a 4-star target that they are currently trending for. The 4-star prospect that they are currently trending for, Calvin Thomas. Makes sense. Definitely a guy that is a blue chip prospect that Carolina, to continue to hear good news on him is definitely encouraging. But then they talk about Carson Snead, the 4-star tight end from the state of Tennessee, a name that you should know because his brother Dayton is currently on the roster and is a guy at the tight end position that Carolina has been recruiting heavily. Now, the interesting thing about this, Zach, is that we have talked about 3 different guys that have committed at the tight end position so far in this recruiting class. You've got Cooper McCutcheon, who is the more traditional tight end. And then you've got 2 jumbo tight ends that Carolina has landed, guys that may not specifically be the typical tight ends, although with the size, I mean, Avian Williams is a little bit closer to it than you would expect. 6'6", 245 pounds. But then you've got the guy that everybody is going to be talking about, Aiden Woods, 6'6". This past year played at 270 pounds, a much bigger player, a guy that many look at as, potentially could convert to an offensive tackle if it doesn't work out at tight end. But those are 3 tight ends that are committed to the class. Now there is potential for them to add a 4th to this class, but a guy that's a 4-star prospect, Zach, and one that you would imagine the reason that they took on Dayton Sneed, just, we'll make it pretty simple for you. He was a guy that didn't play much at Tennessee. He was a walk-on there. More than likely, that was a move to try to get his brother. And right now, it looks like Carolina could be trending in that direction. It seems to be down to them in Florida battling to try to flip him from Tennessee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this is going to be an easy one. I think that Tennessee is going to fight to keep him as they have thus far. But this is a guy that, North Carolina has been talking to for a while. Obviously got his brother to transfer in, got him on an official visit, I believe, in the spring. And so this is one that they will continue to work at, them and Florida, of course, to flip him from Tennessee. Would I project him as of today? I don't know if I'm ready to say that as of yet, but this is one, that they seem to have a little bit of an upswing here going into the fall. So, anything can happen in that regard. And I think that they'd be willing to take 4. This is a position that, at least from past history, we feel is going to be pretty important to the offense that they want to run, likely seeing a lot of 12 or 22 personnel, depending on, the running back situation, but they want to have field, it seems like probably a good chunk of that time. So they got a couple guys in the transfer portal, but this is not a room that they have a ton of youth at. They don't have a ton of bodies right now, really just seeming, I think 5 or 6 scholarship guys. They definitely want to add there if they can. Like you mentioned, they already have 3, but some of those guys could potentially be offensive linemen down the line, depending on how they continue to add weight and develop. So I think that if you get them, that's great. If you don't, you probably feel good with what you have, but it's really sort of there's nothing to lose with this scenario. And it feels like they are really making a solid upswing here for Sneed at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is something that should be seen as a positive. There's no doubt about that. This would be a pretty significant commitment in this class and gives them a true receiving tight end. Cooper McCutcheon has the ability to do that. He's sort of a well-rounded tight end, but isn't nearly as highly ranked as a guy like Carson Sneed is. Sneed is certainly what Carolina is looking for at that tight end position, a guy that can come in and be immediately impactful there as a receiver, because you look at this year's group, that's the biggest question. You've got a lot of guys on this year's group that you feel pretty confident in as blockers, but you don't really have those guys that stand out as receiving threats. Jake Johnson last year really didn't do anything in the receiving game once he took over for the injured Bryson Nesbitt. And then, Connor Cox is a guy that's coming in this year, is going to be here, for a couple of years down the line, but is also a guy that didn't have a lot of production at his previous stop. Same with Shamar Easter, another talented guy that just never really played back at Arkansas. So Carolina's got a lot of different guys that they have added to this room, but that haven't necessarily done anything just yet in their college careers. The one guy that has is Jordan Owens, who was an FCS transferred to Oklahoma State, and then transferred to Carolina. But even that, it's unknown as to whether or not he's going to be a guy that's going to be able to get out there and transition what he did at the FCS level over to the FBS level, and at that, the Power 4 level. So there's a lot of question marks. It would help to get a guy that you trust can do that, can be, what you're looking for at that tight end position from in terms of a wide receiver type tight end. So I definitely think this is a guy that Carolina is going to be focusing on here over the next couple of weeks. They're going to be pushing hard for him. And yeah, Florida is right there battling with them. They did a really good job of getting him on campus for an official visit during the month of June. Carolina, the thing that's not going in their favor is the fact that they hosted him for an official visit way back in late April. But I do think that Carolina is still in a good enough spot here to be able to pounce and get one of the more underrated tight ends in this class, a guy that is a 4-star, but I think certainly has the ability to be one of the best tight ends in this recruiting class when it's all said and done. All right, finally, we get to a guy that Carolina fans have not been talking about. And this one's really interesting to me because I thought with Carolina in the position that they're at the wide receiver spot, we just talked about Carolina's got 4 guys committed to the class so far. They've got 2 guys committed that are 6'4" or bigger. And you would think, okay, they're probably good on the outside. That probably means that they're in a position where they don't have to take anybody else in this receiving class. That does not appear to be the case because now, all of a sudden, a new name has popped up to watch for Carolina fans. And this is one of the guys that is an elite level prospect ranked inside of the top 50 in the class. That would be Joel Wyatt, the wide receiver from the Webb School in Bell Buckle, Tennessee. So a guy that, again, Carolina going into the state of Tennessee, this is a state where Carolina has tried to establish some recruiting routes this year, but just haven't been able to get a commitment out of. But again, they're going in there for Snead, and now they're going after Joel Wyatt. This is, a guy that's right now seems to be down to Tennessee and Vanderbilt. But Carolina getting involved here is certainly interesting, Zach. I think best case scenario for Carolina, if they're wanting to get involved in this recruitment, they're hoping that this is one that they can push back a little bit and get him to visit in the fall if they want to be able to eventually land him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a name that has not really been discussed, was sort of on the radar initially, but it has been one that we've been looking to see, where does he ultimately end up as it relates to any potential recruitment for the Tar Heels? And there's not really been a whole lot of indication of any momentum until now. I mean, he's a guy from Tennessee. The Volunteers were recruiting him very heavily and was initially set to commit on July the 6th. So, this is one that seemed pretty wrapped up for Tennessee, but it's a very positive sort of twist here for North Carolina. It seems like that Tennessee was recruiting him primarily as an edge rusher, plays high school sort of between wide receiver and defensive back, feels like it's going to be wide receiver for North Carolina. So that could be sort of the play here is they're, giving him the ability to play a position that he may prefer in wide receiver, one that he feels more comfortable with. But I think he's a guy that could end up in any number of positions. He's listed per 24/7 Sports as an athlete, I think, for that reason. So he can fit in a number of different roles. But, I mean, this is a bona fide top 50 guy. There's really no doubt about it in terms of that. So I think that we're starting to see with a number of guys that are already committed here in recent weeks, and then more of these prospects that we will see come off the board in forthcoming weeks, is that we're starting to see more of the dividends of what we thought we were going to see with this new staff, with Bill Belichick, with sort of the increased investment that we heard so much about and, have been waiting for of what's this going to look like? We know that we have, a coach that is a multi-time Super Bowl champion, and we know supposedly that there is a greater investment, just whether that's in revenue sharing or NIL, what have you. But the results for some fans have been somewhat mixed. Well, it seems like we're starting to see those dividends. Obviously, there's going to be some time to go in terms of like if these guys will announce different agents, when some of these guys will just commit overall or flip or what have you, and then of course you have to get them signed. But it does seem like right now they're in a pretty good spot. We're starting to see some of those dividends pay off as it relates to either just an increased presence in the recruiting game, or just a little bit more of, getting guys that are more so in that top 500 range.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that you should take away from this, is that Carolina, even if they don't end up landing a guy like Joel Wyatt, because you get in here so late, maybe he doesn't like the position that you're going to end up playing him at. That could be one of the reasons that Carolina, as you mentioned, is really in the running for him, is because they're going to play him at a position that he really wants to play. But it just shows you that Carolina is going after some of these big names. And that's what this class is. It's a mix of guys that have traits, that have plenty of upside, that you feel like Carolina, can really mold once they get here. And now you're starting to get those guys that we've been asking for, those highly talented guys, those guys that are being talked about from the word go when it comes to these recruiting classes, and guys that, are those blue chip prospects. That's what we talk about so much, is that in that top 500, being inside that level, we feel like Carolina's got to be able to land some of those guys to headline this class. And that's what's going to keep Carolina inside of the top 20. I don't think they're going to go much further than that in this class. I've said it. I don't think they're going to be a top 10 class. I don't even think they're going to be a top 15 class, just based on how everything is shaping up right now. But I do think that this will be a top 20 class. And that's something that you can really be proud of as a Carolina fan, considering that this staff has yet to coach a game. But the fact that they're just in the running for these guys, that all of a sudden out of nowhere, a guy that you haven't even had on campus at any point that I know of, he may have been on campus for an unofficial visit way back at some point. But as far as I know, he has not been on campus. His official visits were Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and Louisville. I think that Carolina just being in the running really shows you that they are starting to have a more of a national effect. And I mean, if they can land a guy like Calvin Thomas, we're going to be on here talking about just how good of a headliner group Carolina has for this class. So these guys, these would be great ads. I think Carson Sneed is the guy to definitely keep an eye on out of the two of them. But I think regardless, just the fact that Carolina is even in the conversation is a really good sign for where recruiting is at for this group. And it's only going to get better once Carolina takes the field based off of their play. So who knows? Maybe it doesn't end up getting better, but you're hoping that, it does end up getting better, because there will be something on tape that will allow some of these top guys to be able to consider Carolina more heavily. So that wraps it up for this edition of the podcast, guys. Make sure you head over to the website, HeelToughBlog.com. Check out all of the articles that we have up there for you guys. We got an article going in depth on the commitment of Carnell Warren, even more in depth than we went here tonight. So make sure you go back and check that out. We do have the article up there with, Joel Wyatt and Carson Sneed missing from it, but we do have that article up there earlier in the week about the guys that Carolina was still considering in the class that were still uncommitted. There is one guy that did end up committing today. That would be defensive lineman Carter Gooden, that Carolina fans were hoping to get out of the state of Massachusetts. He ends up committing to UCLA. So he is off the board. Carolina can no longer land him. But the rest of that article filled with plenty of good insight for you guys on where Carolina stands with some of their remaining targets in this 2026 class. And of course, right around the corner for you guys, our position previews are coming up. So don't miss those. We go in depth as we have every single year. We've been doing that since the first year of the podcast. So you don't want to miss any of those coming up. First, of course, will be the quarterback position, and we'll go from there. And those will kind of line up with how we're going to do the podcast. They won't be exactly, out there the days that we do the podcast, because if we did that, the plan is to roll those previews out one by one, day after day, and just give you guys a real stream of content each day. I think that's how we're going to do it. So we won't be able to do a podcast today, but we will be doing a lot of podcasts here coming up, me and Josh, previewing the roster for this upcoming season. So you won't want to miss any of that. Whole bunch of stuff on the way. So with all those coming up, it's important that you guys are on the social media pages, the Twitter page at HT or at Heel Tough Blog on Twitter. Almost gave you the personal Twitter there. But go to the Heel Tough Blog page, follow it, turn on post notifications. That'll let you know whenever we put up any sort of content, including the live videos editions of the podcast. Also, make sure you go over to the YouTube page, subscribe there. If you're someone that's watching on YouTube and you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button right below the video. We would greatly appreciate that. And it will also help you keep up with everything that we're going to be doing here during this season. And then, of course, over on the Facebook page, we've been there for years on the Facebook page. We would love for you to join in on the fun there by giving us a like. That means you will automatically be following the page, so it will put all of the articles on your timeline. Whenever we go live, it will send you a notification that we are going live. So make sure that you're keeping an eye out on all of the content that we've got coming up, because there's going to be a ton of it for you guys that you guys are going to definitely love. And before you know it, it'll be time to jump into fall camp. Now, I don't know what that's going to entail. We do not know whether or not we're going to get more from Bill Belichick, especially us, considering that we are not a credentialed part of the media. So we have to wait and see as to whether or not we will get anything from Bill Belichick, any sort of press conferences where he sort of gives us some sort of information on the team. But regardless, we'll have you covered during fall camp, and then, of course, into the start of the season when Carolina takes on TCU to begin the season on September 1st. So you don't want to miss any of that. Social media is the best way to keep up with it. So once again, that wraps it up for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Zach for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening this evening. And as always, go Tar Heels.